Good morning, folks. Welcome to the January edition of a Teaching Strategies Workshop. Your facilitators are me and Stacy McKenna. Stacy McKenna is a reference and instruction librarian for The Ohio State University at Newark, and I'm Hannah Primo, an instructional designer for The Ohio State University Libraries. If you have any concerns or problems, reach out to chat with one of us. Today, I'm just going to introduce you very quickly to Kristen Henkeline. She'll be doing our first presentation of the day, Supporting Student Motivation in a Virtual Environment. She is a PhD candidate in Educational Psychology and Undergraduate Research Support Services, coordinator for university libraries as well. And she's taught courses in educational psychology at Ohio State University, delivered numerous workshops to both students and instructors on student motivation and self-regulation, and served as an academic coach for both undergraduate and graduate students. And she's been with the university libraries since May of 2019. It's been a joy to have her. She previously was the first year experience associate, so she's had a lot of experience with our first year undergraduate students. So I'm going to let her take over. Oh, one last
Hi,
thing, captioning. You're going to see captioning. You can adjust it on the bottom. So sorry, Kristen. If it's
no problem.
bothering you, we have options on how you can shift that right here. Go forth, Kristen.
Great, you can hear me. I'm not accidentally on mute or anything, right? I've been known to do that before. Well, thank you for attending. And again, my name is Kristen Hinkline, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about supporting student motivation in a virtual environment. Most of my dissertation work has been in student motivation, and it's something that I really enjoy studying and talking about. So I'm excited to share what I know about student motivation with all of you. To get started, my objectives for this session. So the first thing I want to do is consider the impact of virtual learning on student motivation. Obviously, there have been a lot of changes for students recently, and it has had a big impact on student motivation. And we'll talk a little bit about what maybe you as instructors, or if you're working with students in other capacities, have seen, and then also maybe what we're hearing from students. Most of this will be anecdotal at this point. I know there are lots and lots of surveys going out, and I'm sure there will be tons of research later about the impact that this has had on students. But to get started, we'll kind of be looking at more of the anecdotal. And then the second thing is to examine several theories of student motivation to learn and their application to the virtual environment. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the theories that I think relate best to the current situation and how they can help us understand student motivation. And then last, identifying strategies to support student motivation. So I want to start off by defining motivation, because I know that it can be kind of a murky concept, and sometimes it can be confused with engagement, and it really is different from engagement. So motivation is the process whereby goal-directed activity is instigated and sustained. In other words, motivation is directed towards a goal. And our goals can change at any time, so our motivations can change at any time. But the way that we kind of, when we're looking at students and their motivation, we're inferring their motivation from actions and verbalizations. So a student who engages in course discussions frequently, completes assignments, asks questions, these are all things that they're behaviors that we're inferring high motivation from. And one thing I always like to mention is that motivation always exists. It just gets directed towards different goals. So the idea that some students just aren't motivated isn't really accurate. Their motivations just might be for different things. And especially in the environment that we're currently in, given the context that we're all experiencing, this is something that probably is happening quite a bit. Students' motivations have changed, and they may be directed in different places than they had been previously. So the first thing I want to talk about is how has virtual learning impacted students' motivation to learn from what you have seen? What have you seen in courses you've taught or sessions you've taught? What have you heard from colleagues? And we're going to put our responses into Padlet. Hannah, I believe, or Stacy is going to give you a link to Padlet, and you can add what you have seen here. I've also added some of the things that I have seen or heard from others. Hannah, is that link in the chat?
Yep, I just popped it into the chat.
Perfect. Can you see the Padlet screen on my end?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. So the first one here, how has virtual learning impacted student motivation? What have instructors noticed? So students are overworked, yes, and actually we'll talk about that when we get to the next question about what have you heard students say, because I do think that is something that students are experiencing. Some of the things that I've noticed is that the pass, no pass is leading to some lower motivation to complete tasks for students who maybe had previously been a more performance oriented and striving for those A's and B's. Now, if they're just focusing on passing a class, may not have the same motivation to complete other tasks. And if you want to add, some of your thoughts or things that you've seen, you can just hit this plus sign right here and then type in your responses. Some other things, it can be hard to get students to participate in conversations. I know some students are preferring chat over actually raising their hands and talking in a Zoom environment. And this is something, so freshmen having difficulty with time adjusting, I think this is new first year students are struggling probably more than any other group of students right now because they went through a huge transition to come to college, and now it's just a very different environment than anything they've learned in before. One of the things I know is videos not being turned on, videos off and feeling disconnected from others. From a lot of colleagues I've talked with, it seems that first year students are more likely than any other group actually to have their videos turned off. And it could be they're not comfortable with having their videos on in this new environment. Feeling distracted, doing other things while on Zoom. I think this is definitely something that's happening for a lot of students. Different pressures overtaking the focus. So again, they have a lot going on. And so where they may have been motivated in their coursework before, it's suddenly not the priority anymore. Trying to turn in anything to get credit. So I think the pass, no pass has contributed a lot to this, especially I would say at Ohio State. And I have heard a lot that it seems like students really are eager to see each other in person. Okay, so you can continue to add to this, and we'll come back to Padlet here in a second. But these are all things I think a lot of instructors and others who work with students are seeing. So some of you have started already filling out the second column there, and that's what are students reporting. So what have you heard specifically from students? So this could be students you've taught, supervised, or worked with in any capacity, and that's what you'll add then to that second column in Padlet. And I'm going to go back here. So some of the things that I know I have heard, so I've sat in on several student panels and the students have discussed their experiences. Again, this is anecdotal, but I would say across the panels, probably roughly about 25 students that I've heard from. I also supervise about 12 students, and we've had conversations frequently about their experiences, and just talking with other students. Again, this is anecdotal, but some of the things that they've brought up are that they just feel really exhausted from Zoom. I think a lot of us experience that. They also have mentioned inconsistency in course format, which this one was a surprise to me, but feeling like so some of the classes may be listed as synchronous, but then they get into it and the instructor switches it to asynchronous or vice versa. And so there's not really a consistent format for the course. So as somebody who may go in and do a workshop or a one shot with students, I think this is something to really keep in mind. You know, if the course is set up to be synchronous, then trying to be consistent and also providing synchronous options. Or if it is asynchronous, trying to be consistent with that, because students were expressing a feeling of disorganization because they didn't always know going into the class if they should be going to it, if it was synchronous that day or if it was asynchronous that day. Students have mentioned, not having enough contact with others and not having the same kind of breaks they usually do. So they are starting to feel kind of this sense of burnout. And then I think one of the big things that I heard over and over and over again from students is feeling like they have too much busy work and that the work that they're being assigned is not meaningful. There's far more of it than there used to be. So there's more assignments, there's more testing, and they just aren't feeling like this increase in work is really helping them to learn. There's actually an interesting post in the Chronicle of Higher Education. I think Hannah has the link to that if you have access to that. And it was about this disconnect between what professors are saying is happening and what students are saying, where professors are feeling like they're not actually increasing workload, but students are really feeling like there is an increase in this workload and busy work. And then there was also a follow-up article in Inside Higher Ed about this. One of the things I think is really important to keep in mind is that students' perceptions really matter because they're a huge influencer of motivation. So even if as instructors or somebody who goes in and does workshops, we don't feel like we're actually increasing the level of work, or we really feel like maybe if we are increasing it, it's still really meaningful. If our students aren't perceiving it that way, it's still going to impact their motivation. So one thing we need to think about is how we can better align our practices with students' perceptions. So this could come down to making sure we are explaining to students the importance of what we're doing and why, so that they understand that if it does feel like it's a little bit more, there's a reason, and that the work is meaningful. Or maybe even thinking about cutting down a little bit on what we are having students do in a session. Because again, although we may feel like that's not what's happening, students' perceptions really do matter at the end of the day because of their influence on motivation. So I see lots of comments here of things that you are hearing from students. So a lot of feeling lost, missing being in person. I definitely think this is a very real feeling for a lot of students. Oops, my PowerPoint just disappeared and I was getting ready to go back to it. So just a second. Here we go. Okay. So yeah, there's a lot of great stuff in here. Feelings of being overwhelmed. They're visiting the libraries less. And so they're virtually using everything right now. Confusion with Carmen. And so again, I think this goes to inconsistency in format. They've been pushed to one format, but they just aren't, feeling like it's all organized, and they're, managing all of these different platforms in some cases. I know some students are actually doing their classes through Teams here at OSU. Others are using Zoom. Some are synchronous, some are asynchronous. And so it feels like there's a lot to manage. I have heard this from a lot of the students I supervise, that they're going to never skip an in-person session again, that that they realized how important the in-person sessions really were. And so they were going to go to every single class once they were able to attend face-to-face again. So this one's still in the process of being typed, but I think this is also a really important one. We're kind of missing a feedback loop. So it's harder to communicate with each other. And it's also just with videos are off, it's hard to know if students are engaged because you can't necessarily see them. So even if we're not getting verbal feedback from students, we may not also be getting visual feedback to know how students are doing. These are all great, and you can continue to add comments in here. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint now. So the next thing I want to talk about are some theories of motivation that I think can help us to think about student motivation. And first, I'm going to kind of do this broad overview of motivation again, because I know it can be a tricky concept, just to help us understand, what it looks like. So we have factors that influence motivation, and these are both internal and external. So internal factors could be students' own personal goals. Sometimes students are taking courses that don't align with their goals, and in that case, they may have a lower motivation for the course. And if it's a course where it really does align with their goals, they may have higher motivation for it. Because these are internal, they're harder to have an impact on. But there are also external factors that influence motivation. So the virtual environment is a huge factor that's influencing it. And there are a lot of factors within that are contributing to motivation. Motivation, again, is something that we can only infer. So what we're really looking at are the behaviors. So behaviors that indicate motivation, student motivation, are things like choice. Are they choosing to do the assignments? Are they choosing to continue to take courses or courses in specific subject areas? Are they choosing to come to our workshops and participate in our sessions? Are they putting forth effort when they face a challenge? Are they persisting and trying to overcome? Are they re-engaging in the content? These are all things that tell us about students and their motivation. And what we know is that these are all things that support learning and performance. So the more often students persist when they're challenged or put in effort or continue engagement, the more likely they are to be successful in their learning and performance. So like I mentioned, I'm going to cover 3 theories here that I think are really helpful, but they're really just scratching the surface. And we're not going to go too in depth. I'm really just pulling out the things here that I think apply to our current situation. Interest theory has identified kind of 4 phases. And I think this is really useful if we're thinking about these first 2. So one of the things we can do to help students to be more motivated in the class is to try and trigger their interest. Students may not necessarily be interested initially in what we're presenting or what we're talking about. And interest theory really talks about how you can move through these phases to develop interest. But this first phase is this triggered situational interest. So it's short term and it's externally supported. It's sparked by the environment or novelty or personal relevance. And it's something that is external. So it's something that we can do to help support student interest. This could be using different teaching methods. It could be making the content more relevant. But if we get that initial interest from students, we can try and continue to maintain it through the content we're teaching and the tasks we're providing to get students to engage in that material. Another theory that is widely discussed in student motivation is self-determination theory. And again, I'm just going to kind of scratch the surface with this one. It's a really broad theory that has a lot more components to it that we just won't have time to cover. But I think overall, it can be a really helpful theory to think about when it comes to student motivation. Essentially, it's saying that for intrinsic motivation to exist, students' needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness need to be met. So autonomy is this feeling that you're in control of what you are doing, that you have a level of choice. Competence is feeling capable. So can I do this? Am I able to accomplish this task? Can I learn this material? And relatedness is feeling connected to and respected by others. So, do I feel like I belong in this class? Do I have others that I can relate to? We already know that relatedness is a struggle in a virtual environment. So this is a need that may not be getting met in a virtual environment for students. But there are things that we can do to try and increase this relatedness. And when we talk about strategies later on, we'll talk about some ways that we can try and improve that sense of relatedness in a virtual environment. Okay. And then this next one is expectancy value theory. So this is where a lot of my work has actually existed. This theory is something that I've used quite a bit and I found really useful, especially in my teaching, to think about. So basically, we're looking at two things that influence motivation: expectancy for success. So this is really similar to competence. Can I be successful here? Can I complete this task? Do I have the support I need? Do I have the quality of instruction necessary to do the work? And then values. So, what are the benefits of doing this task? If you have a high sense of expectancy for success and you really value the task, your motivation will be higher. And I think we tend to think a lot about things like, how can I get students interested? What can I do? Or is this task going to be something students complete? Are they going to be capable of it? Is it at their level? But we sometimes forget to spend time really thinking about the benefit of tasks for students. So I want to focus a little bit more on this one. There are four subcomponents of values, and I think all four of them can be really useful to think about in the virtual environment and really just in general when we're teaching. And again, value tends to be one that we overlook a lot of times. So the first one is utility value, the usefulness of the task for future goals. That could be immediate or it could be long-term future goals. Is what I'm learning going to be something I'm going to need to use in this class, in a later class, in my career? How useful is this task or knowledge going to be? Intrinsic value is really the enjoyment experience from engaging in the task. And attainment value confirms or disconfirms some part of your identity. So I identify as somebody who is really good at math, and therefore I tend to be more motivated in math because it continues to confirm my identity. And then cost can be perceived negative or actually positive aspects, but a lot of times it tends to be the negative. So time comes up a lot with cost. Is engaging in this task going to be worth the time? So for an example, if let's say you're teaching students about the steps involved in research, if they have low utility value, they may not feel like they're going to use this skill in the future. Maybe they don't think they'll be doing research later on, whether it's in future courses or maybe it's for their career. Research is just, in this instance, it's something they just need to get through and do right now, but it's not something that they'll utilize later on. Well, this will lead to lower motivation for the task. If they have low intrinsic value, maybe they don't enjoy the process of research, and so they may be less motivated. And if they have low attainment value, it could be that they don't identify as a researcher or an academic, or they don't really feel like they have a contribution that they can make to the literature. And so it doesn't really confirm their identity to engage in this task. And then the last one is cost. And I think this one comes up a lot. It just takes too much time to do research. So they may feel like for them, the benefit is to cut corners because they feel like putting that extra time in, that they're not getting out of it. At the end of the day, it's not benefiting them. So we'll go back now over to Padlet and thinking about these four subcomponents of value. Let me switch back here. How are values connected to what instructors are seeing our students are reporting? Can we make connections to what we've already talked about, to values, to these four values: utility value, intrinsic value, attainment value, and cost? I could say, for one thing, I think students are feeling like they are having a lot more work to do, right? There's a lot more busy work as they see it. And so maybe they feel like the cost here is that they're putting in more time for work and there's not really a benefit that they're getting out of it. So again, how are values connected to what instructors are seeing or what students are reporting? So I think this is a good one. Students feeling like it isn't what they signed up for, so they maybe have less intrinsic motivation. Um, this intrinsic value or just an enjoyment of the work is not always there for students. This is probably one of those that's hardest to overcome. A lot of our students are taking classes or sessions, are participating in workshops because they're required to, and it's not necessarily because of choice. So their intrinsic value may already be lower, and then that's where it's really important for us to think about the utility value, the attainment value, and the cost, because we may not be able to do as much about the intrinsic value. And this is a good point. There's only so many hours in the day, so students are making value decisions based on courses, and not all courses are going to be worth the same amount of time and effort. So unfortunately, we may be the one going in to teach a session or a workshop, and that day their priority is somewhere else. And so spending the time working on that may not be where they see the benefit. Maybe instead they're kind of checking out of the session because they're working on something else that they think has a greater benefit for them to complete. And so one of these is kind of getting to this idea of utility value, that if students don't see the value in doing something for the future, even if we know it'll be beneficial, they don't always know that it'll be beneficial. I could say personally, as an undergrad, I didn't necessarily recognize the importance of learning some of the skills for conducting research and understanding the process. And then I got to graduate school and I felt really overwhelmed and realized I wish I'd paid a lot more attention and sought out more resources as an undergraduate, because I wasn't as prepared as I thought I was going to be when I entered graduate school. So sometimes students don't realize or understand how beneficial it is for them to gain some of those skills now, because they will use them later. And so that's an area where we can help them to understand the importance of what they're learning now for their future. And I really like this point. It's sometimes hard to see the value without a conversation. And we're going to talk about some ways that we can help students see the value. But it really is hard to do that without some sort of conversation. I think a lot of times we feel like we're covering the importance or the value of our content in our objectives or our learning outcomes. But a lot of times that doesn't resonate with students. They read those, they don't think about them for very long, and then they move on. And again, that's also instructor directed. So I'm telling them the value, I'm telling them why it's important. And sometimes the conversation can be a great way to develop that value, because the students then may be generating why it's useful for them or how it might help them. And that conversation can lead to increased motivation, more so than us just telling students why things are important. That's a great point. Okay, you can continue to add to this page. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint now. So again, I really didn't get too in depth in these theories. What I wanted to pull out were just some of these factors that influence motivation, because these three theories, and there are many, many more theories of motivation, be boiled down to some important factors. And the list of factors is much larger than this, but I really just wanted to focus on these four, because I think these are things that we can do now in our sessions to support student motivation. So it really boils down to interest, needs. So that's the relatedness, autonomy, and competence, expectancies, and value. So the next thing I'm going to do is talk a little bit about each of these and what we can do in one session. I guess I could stop here, Hannah. Are there any big questions I should answer about these before I go forward?
There's one question sitting in the chat. Let me scroll back up to it. It was by a Michael. So they said for years online learning, they've used an About Me opening statement post. Has anyone researched if that's actually effective in establishing relatedness? Do you know anything about that?
So I actually can't offhand think of any research specifically that has looked at that About Me statements. I mean, anecdotally, I use them as well, and I think they can be really beneficial to get that sense of relatedness started. But in a one shot or a workshop, you don't have a lot of time. So a lot of times an About Me statement is the best you've got to start off with. And then, as you're moving through your short session, trying to make sure that you're supportive and talking with students. In a semester long class, I think an About Me statement is a great way to get started, but relatedness continues throughout the semester. So it's what you do every session to get to know your students and continue that conversation and let them know who you are. And there has been research that's shown that, letting students in and letting them know who you are and sharing your experiences matters. But as far as kind of specific to an About Me statement, I can't offhand think of anything that's looked specifically at that. That's a great question. Any other questions?
And as you think of them, you can put them in the question and answers, and we'll have time afterwards as well to answer. So don't fret if you don't have anything yet or you're still simmering on stuff.
I just wanted to stop here only because I know I just went pretty quickly through some motivation theory that I spent years studying. So this was kind of a pretty a quick overview. So if there are any questions related to that, I do think Hannah's going to send out these PowerPoint slides. And again, this is all kind of just scratching the surface, but in case there are any questions related to that. So the final thing is, what can we do in one session? So with interests, I think one thing we can do is allow choice whenever it's possible. Now, there has been research to show that there's kind of a balance here. So if there's too much choice, it can actually lead students to feel overwhelmed. But having some amount of choice can help them feel, one, that they have more of a sense of autonomy, but also it can allow them to pursue their interests. So if you have a task, for instance, practicing searching, allowing students to select what they're looking for, what their search terms are going to be, or assignments where they can pick something that's of interest to them can be a useful way to kind of get that triggered situational interest. Another thing too is creating variety in your delivery to help trigger interest. And for me, creating variety has always been a challenge. I always have to think really hard about it, especially if I'm going to be seeing the same students over and over again, creating that variety. One thing that I really love is this, and I think Hannah's going to put the link in the chat, is the K. Patricia Cross Academy. So I actually have two books that are related to this. One that K. Patricia Cross wrote, and another one that I think was one of her mentees. But there's some really great strategies here that you can use to kind of develop interest and engagement. And what I like about this website, one, it's all free. They have videos and they have things you can download to go with the videos. And you can search here. So you can actually search online implementation. Right now, there's around 20, I think, that have been adapted for online, but they're still continuing to develop those and adapt to more of them. But it is a great website if you're looking for a way to get that triggered situational interest and do something maybe that's a little bit different. Some of them are things you'll probably recognize, like Jigsaw, which is widely used, and others may be things that you had never thought of before. But I do find this to be a pretty useful website. One thing I do want to say, though, as a caveat when developing interest, is that we want to make sure we're not doing it at the expense of learning. So sometimes we get so excited about creating these activities and these, really fun, engaging sessions, and we go too far in that direction, and the learning can get lost. An example I have recently is I took a leadership seminar, and it was set up as an escape room, and it was online, a virtual escape room. And honestly, it went a little too far in the let's catch your interest side of things and focused too much on the escape room side of it, to the point where the content was lost. And afterwards, I walked away thinking, wow, that was really fun. I had a great time. But I honestly couldn't tell you much of anything that I remember from the session, or any of the content that was covered in it, because it did kind of veer off a little bit more into the fun side of things at the expense of learning. So that is one caveat to think about. Is it's great to mix things up and try and grab interest, but you also have to balance that with making sure that you're not losing the learning. And then needs. So again, relatedness. This is a really challenging one in a virtual environment, but trying to create opportunities to interact and connect virtually through chat or other platforms. One of the things we know is that asynchronous sessions specifically can feel really isolating and lonely. You're one person going through this asynchronous course, but if you can include things in your asynchronous sessions, like a Padlet page that we just did, or some way for them to interact or have discussions with others, it reminds them that there are other people who are in the course and that they're not the only student taking the class. You can also do this in synchronous sessions too, just to remind them that somebody, other people are there and they do have the opportunity to interact. It may feel like a small way to try and build that relatedness, because we're still not in person. We're not having discussions. We're not necessarily always seeing other people, but it is a small way to increase that relatedness, so that they know that they're not necessarily alone, that there are others out there who are taking the class and engaging in the work. We use Padlet today as an example. It's one that I really like because it's great for brainstorming, and you can set up the pages differently for interaction to occur. And in my department, I think thanks to Hannah, we do all use it quite a bit. So autonomy, this is another one of the needs. So allowing some choice. And again, this can be choice in picking what they're going to be working on or what they're going to be looking at. One thing I really like is allowing them to choose the way they debrief content. So this can give them the option of applying, reflecting, or questioning the material. So if they choose to apply it, maybe they really know, okay, I just learned this skill or strategy and I know how I'm going to apply it to a different situation or a specific situation. Or maybe they choose to reflect on it. I like to add this to give students autonomy for those who really feel at the end like it's still not something they're going to utilize. They can spend some time reflecting on, if I'm not going to implement this strategy or I don't think it's useful, why not? And then the last one here is giving them the opportunity to develop questions. So maybe they didn't get everything answered and they want to continue to question this strategy or skill that they've just learned, or think about some follow-ups that they may engage in to learn more about it. Again, it's a small thing, but it's allowing them the autonomy of how they're debriefing what they've just learned. And it can also help make it a little bit more relevant for them. So expectancies, again, are very similar to competence. One big thing is just gauging where your students are at before a session, especially when you're going in for a one-shot or a workshop. Even just asking students some questions ahead of time, or talking to the instructor to kind of know where students are at, so you know how to modify your content to make sure it's at an appropriate level for them. Another thing, and this has come up a lot with students who feel really disorganized right now, is making sure that we're being as clear and organized as possible, because this actually really does help students feel more competent. Another one is breaking tasks up so students do not feel overwhelmed. But one of the things we know about the virtual environment is that students really feel like they're already seeing a huge increase in work. So I think where we typically might break up assignments to make students feel less overwhelmed, so they don't have this huge, big thing coming up, we also have to make sure we're not going the other direction with that, and that we're not giving this perception of too much busy work because we've broken things up too much. So there's kind of has to be a balance here. So we break it up so it's not too overwhelming, but not so much that they now feel like they have a lot of busy work and they're not feeling like it's a meaningful time spent. And then values. So again, this is not just about objectives and learning goals, but asking students to reflect on how the information extends beyond the classroom. It starts by us thinking about what the purpose is of our tasks and why it's important for students to engage in. This is actually something I've done research in social studies education, is asking social studies teachers why social studies is important. And it's really hard for teachers to explain the relevance in what they're teaching sometimes. And so this is something I think more broadly for all of us to think about. Why are we creating these tasks? Why are we teaching this? Do we understand the purpose and why it's important for students to engage? Because if we don't really have a clear sense of that, then it's going to be hard for us to help our students understand it. Another thing you can do is ask students to generate ideas about how they'll use what they've learned. So you can ask them to do this to extend it beyond the classroom. For instance, if you're teaching them search strategies or precision searching, you can talk to them about how they may need to use this in future classes and in college, or if they go on to graduate school. But what about when they graduate and they're looking for internship, or prior to graduation, looking for internships or looking for jobs? How could these searching skills help them to narrow down, say, hundreds of jobs so they can find the ones that are the right fit for them? Or there are other times when they may need to use those search skills outside of their courses and outside of college that would be really important to learn. So trying to help students connect beyond just the immediate and beyond the classroom, how they'll use things. But again, one of the important things here is to make it as student generated as possible. So I love the idea of having some sort of a conversation, or even just an ideas board, or a way for everybody to collaborate on the value and importance, because the more student generated it is, the more students are going to internalize that value, and the more likely it will increase their motivation. And this last one on here is having students engage in the strategy before teaching it. This was an example in a book. It's more recent. It's Small Teaching Online. It was the follow-up to Small Teaching. And I really liked this suggestion when I read it, as having students engage in a strategy before teaching it. So maybe asking them, to find something, maybe a really difficult article to find, and then just, sending them to the library's webpage and seeing how far they get. And a lot of students might not be successful in this task, but it might actually show them the importance of learning about how to search, or where to go, or how to even use the library website. Just teaching it to them or demoing it may not give them that same sense as having them do that activity first without having taught it. And then they kind of get that realization that, oh, I need to learn this, because if I need to do this again, I'm not really going to know how. So I thought this was a great strategy to kind of help students really feel that value. Okay, so the last thing, just to wrap up here, is to think about how you can apply motivation strategies to your sessions. So we'll go back again here to the Padlet page. What strategies could you apply to your practice, or are there strategies that you're already using that you found to be helpful? I certainly didn't cover everything, and there may be things you're using that you think are really supporting student motivation that you'd like to share. So if there's something that in this presentation you think would be really useful that you could adapt, let us know how you might adapt that. Or if there are other ways that you've found to be helpful to support student motivation, please contribute that as well to the Padlet. And we will go back. So that will be the fourth column here. Yeah, I have not used Flipgrid a lot, but I know a lot of students are familiar with Flipgrid, and they actually like using that tool as well. Letting students vote on topics. Using surveys in Carmen. That's great. So actually there was a research study recently, I think it was 2019. It's one that I've just recently been reading on learning and instruction in the hybrid virtual classroom that found that having quizzes and polls in synchronous and asynchronous courses led to more intrinsic motivation. So there's something about them completing those and having those kind of like at certain intervals that was increasing their motivation. So that's something you can always do, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous, is throw in some quizzes in the middle, or polling. Polling feels less high stakes, but that can also be a tool to use. Again, though, thinking about not overusing it, because as we know, students are feeling a little bit like they're being tested more frequently than previously.
And
So true
Kristen,
fault activities can also be a great way to just kind of identify where students are at. So you can gauge that. Yeah. Sorry, Hannah, you were.
oh, it's
My
totally fine. We
time
have
is
about
up.
5 questions.
Oh,
And so
yeah.
I don't want us to get lost with the questions, and people can keep filling in and we can reference those back. So
Sure.
I believe you can see the question and answers, but I can also read them off if you'd like.
Oh, they're right there. Yes. Okay. Just to make sure I'm following, would you go ahead and read them off?
Gladly. So Russell has asked, given that we can only infer motivation, what are some of the ways that we can effectively extract each of the 4 factors from the students so that you can make the best inferences?
So the 4 factors, are you referring to, so kind of the factors, let me go back here. Interest, needs, or expectancies and values. Let me reread this one, make sure I'm answering it correctly.
They said in chat, yes. So there
Yeah.
you go.
So if you're looking at those, I think, interest, all of them can be inferred again by behaviors. So we're looking for those behaviors like if they're interested in it, are they engaging in the tasks? If you're asking questions, are they answering them? If you're doing an activity that requires them to put forth some amount of effort, are they putting forth that effort? So I mentioned that page that has a lot of different ideas for engaging students in different ways. If students are, not engaging in those tasks and choosing not to do them, that's an indication that they're not really motivated. When we're looking at competence, you can kind of infer this by if they hit a point where something's challenging, do they keep going and they try and overcome it and get past it? Or do when they hit that challenge, they go, oh, I can't do this anymore. This is too hard. And then now they're kind of checking out a little bit and not continuing on. That's a really good indicator. And again, with value, I think it's, you're with any of them, you're just really looking for what are their actions and their verbalizations. Are they talking to you about the content? Are they engaging in conversations? Are they identifying ways that the information is going to be useful to them? Looking at those behaviors and those verbalizations.
And I think we're going to probably run out of time, but we're going to keep on answering questions. I'm going to give everyone a heads up that the same link works for our afternoon session. That's all. So Jane has our next question. She has asked, is there any thoughts on how to have a good balance between catching interest with different deliveries while maintaining the consistency that students seem to want for online courses?
Well, I definitely think, again, there's a good balance. You don't want to do too many things in a session, especially if you have, let's say, 1 hour with students. In that amount of time, you're probably not going to pick to try out 5 different new teaching methods, right? Maybe trying 1 or 2 or even 3, although 3 in that short amount of time might even be pushing it. So there's definitely, you want to maintain some consistency. I think, if you're going in for a one shot, way you can maintain consistency is by delivering it the same way the students are experiencing the class. So if they're already in a synchronous class, delivering your presentation synchronously. If it's asynchronous, doing it asynchronously is one way to keep that consistency. And then, within that, you can look at how the instructor has formatted things to try and maintain some consistency. And then just as you're trying teaching methods, not going too far in a direction where you're trying too many things or doing things that might be too overwhelming.
Elizabeth has asked, what is your take on trying to vary tone and pacing of your voice as the instructor? Is it worth focusing on?
So this is one of the things that I think has always been a challenge for me, pacing especially. I do think it is worth focusing on, and I think it does matter to students. So tone is one of those environmental factors that can increase interest. It's external to the student, but if you have a tone that, catches their attention, I do think it's something that can trigger situational interest. It's not going to sustain it. There's obviously other things you'll have to do, but it's certainly something you can start with. And pacing really actually can affect competence. So if things are moving too fast, students will feel like they're not capable, and that can really affect their motivation. So having a good pace and allowing students to feel like they can stay with you. Again, pacing is one of my biggest challenges that I'm always trying to work on, because I do know that does affect a student's sense of competence. So yeah, I think both of them are important.
Wonderful. We have a last couple from Michael, who has asked almost the crowd, who else feels like you haven't done enough when you aren't getting questions or feedback? During an instructional session, if I can't get students to ask questions, I feel like I'm not engaging.
Yeah, so I think this is really tough in a virtual environment because we already know students feel less comfortable engaging. We also know that having them engage is really important. So it's kind of a challenge, right? And I think finding ways to engage students virtually, it has to be different than how we did it in a face-to-face setting. So finding ways to, if you may not be asking them to ask questions out loud. Instead, you're trying to get them to ask questions through chat, or maybe you're doing something like the Padlet where they can put it on there and it's anonymous. They may be more likely to ask questions if they feel like other people aren't staring at their answers going, oh, so-and-so just asked that question. Putting it in surveys can be another way to get to elicit questions. Likely, if you've got students in the classroom who are engaging in the material, they likely have questions they may just not feel comfortable asking them. So it could just be trying to find alternative ways to get students to submit those questions. Again, I do think having it be anonymous can be really helpful. So Qualtrics is a great option if it's not something where you need the questions immediately, and you can ask them at the end of a session and then follow up, through email. Or again, something like Padlet, which is also anonymous.
Wonderful. This ties up our time for today. So thank you everyone for the extreme participation that you did. Thank you again for Kristen for sharing all this knowledge with us. This recording will be available after the fact. You'll see an email sometime this week. And that attached will be the PowerPoints and all the links that were shared within. Thank you everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you this afternoon, hopefully. Take care.